Trust the small work of God within you. Trust the work, trust the small work, trust the small work of God within you.
Today we're visiting with Father Michael Drinkwater, the rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in Alamogordo, New Mexico. In addition to being a priest, Michael is also a father, a spouse, a linguist, and the diocesan missioner for Indigenous ministries. For starters, can you tell us about the relationship between your vocation as a scholar and your vocation as a priest?
You know, it's really interesting. My academic calling and my calling as a priest, in a lot of ways, they developed side by side, and in other ways, they developed completely independent of one another. And then, in a very real way, kind of bringing them both together in a practical way has been a completely different animal from doing either one separately. The discernment to the priesthood was kind of the first piece that I needed to settle, and in some ways, it kind of led to the being able to discern my call as an academic and a scholar. You know, I was really lucky that one of the places that I knew I interviewed well at here at the cathedral in Albuquerque, you know, back 10 years ago. Was also really close to a university that specialized in linguistics, and on top of that, worked with indigenous languages specific to the Southwest where I'd be living. Um, and in some ways, that kind of touched on an older calling I had, and this ties. You know, all of these things are connected in some really strange ways. Yeah, and being able to approach my studies in language with the intent of doing the healing and reconciling work of language revitalization. I was only able to do that because I was so centered in the priesthood.
Mm.
And it's something that people in the academic world are still kind of surprised in my work, that I am a priest and am also called to revitalize and bring back this really ancient perspective, which is definitively non-Christian.
Mm.
So, but that goes back to me to our baptismal covenant and honoring the dignity of every human being, right? And part of a person's dignity is their culture. So,
Take a moment to pause and reflect. Are there facets of your own identity and vocation that other people might find surprising or incongruous? How do you experience the conflict and the complementarity between these different facets of your call? Father Michael, among the many facets of your call is a vocation to family life. Tell us a little bit about that.
both of us, both my wife and I, felt called both to marriage and to parenthood very distinctly from a young age. Um, my wife's family did foster care growing up. My wife's mother, my mother-in-law, was really active in CASA, court-appointed special advocates. Um, for my own story, like, my house was always the safe place for all of our friends. Um, and there was something about that that was really beautiful and that I wanted to carry forward in my own life. Um, and uh, and so we both kind of felt a really distinct call to parenthood, and because we felt a distinct call to parenthood, um, the way that we engage that is different, right? Because it's a calling to raise up a new generation of healed people to do the healing of work and reconciliation. And that means dealing with our own trauma in the process of not creating more, or at least where we can. Um, and so, yeah, it's all kind of, as with everybody, right? One vocation is always intimately tied to the rest of our lives. And
Take a moment to pause and reflect. How does your own family of origin and your family of choice reflect and shape your vocation? So, Father Michael, at a recent clergy conference, you shared with us how you're gaining some new insights about how your mind works. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your journey of understanding the ways in which you're neurodiverse and how that impacts your vocation.
let's see. Well, my wife is an educator, and she's been an educator for as long as we've been together. It was one of the things that drew us together. She started on her vocational journey around the same time I did, and she's worked a lot with um, kids in our school system in New Mexico with special learning needs, developmental neuroatypicalities, things like that. So had a lot of experience when she was teaching in Albuquerque, teaching kids on the spectrum. And I'd been kind of called, our bishop very plainly at our first clergy conference talked openly about his desire for all of us to engage in therapy and spiritual direction. And as I delved deeper into my own healing, I started to see things that felt, started to see things in me that I couldn't reason around. Like some things, transitions have always been challenging for me around changes in plans, um, things like that. And so we began discerning in November of 2020 if I might be on the spectrum. Um, and parallel to that, in October of 2020, I started my work with the Migonadi Institute, which is a nonprofit sort of reclaiming the sacred stories of the Jicarilla Apache um, from the work of an Anglo linguist about 100 years ago. And those two things don't really seem connected at first, but a lot of what I ran into as I kept kind of butting heads with my own neurodiversity was that this idea of good and bad, at least as we've defined it in some sense, doesn't really work for me. The way that my brain is wired, my first response is never yes. I have the way that my brain works is that my initial reaction to something is always a challenge. Um, and so if we define being good as the desire to do what other people want when they ask you to, then I'm not good in that sense. My desire to get into language initially is kind of a product of my ADHD and autism, because I don't really study languages the way other people do. I study a language until I lose interest in it and then move on to kind of another one. And that way has always kind of been frustrating and fascinating to people who've watched me do that. But I learned or I studied German for a little while, and I had a lot of fun doing it. And I knew that as long as I could study something which opened up new perspectives within the human experience, then I'd be feeding something deep inside of me. And sort of so you can see how that's kind of the neurodiversity, the scholarly call, and the religious call are all kind of rolled into one. But I did kind of have to do the discernment on each of them one at a time. Um, and I described one of the things that I described at clergy conference was, and I talked about it in a different way not too long ago, that my first reaction is always to challenge. And in some ways, that's been really good because nobody's been able to lie to me about scripture my entire life. Because the way that my memory works, when somebody says something about scripture, I can't help but check it against everything I know about scripture all at once. And so, in some ways, you can see how that builds me up for success. In other ways, you can see how that might bog me down in the weeds and get me stuck sometimes. Um, but I have a very violent relationship with truth. I have to kind of uh, beat and break things against the central truths of my life. And one of those central truths is that healing and reconciliation out of the ministry of Jesus. And so that's one of the stories that, even though I've continued to kind of bend it, break it, stretch it, it still feeds me and it still brings me courage to make a difference where I can. Um, and and also not to put on too big of a hat because there's a lot to do out there and it can't all be done by me. So I'm really grateful. There are some ways in which this job is a real gift to someone like me, um, because as a priest, we're called to so many and varied things that it's really suitable for someone like me to give a lot of attention to one thing, kind of super focus on our hospitality, our music, our liturgy for a little while, and then kind of sit back, do some discerning and learning work, and then focus on something else again. And that the process has worked okay with St. John's. Not to say that I have to be flexible with my needs, just like any priest. But having a little better idea of what my needs are makes it a lot easier to negotiate those moments. Um,
Take a moment to pause and reflect. Father Michael is on a journey of discovery about how God is calling him to live and minister as a person on the autism spectrum with ADHD. How might your own unique differences, both your abilities and your disabilities, your limitations and your gifts, shape your vocation? So, Father Michael, in all these different manifestations of your vocation, I wonder, what are the common threads you see that weave through all of them?
I started working on this idea of Jesus as the source of healing and salvation, healing, redemption, and forgiveness. Um, and started seeing Christianity sort of outside of this lens of good and bad and more in the lens of when in our history have we done a really good job of living into our call to be healers, reconcilers, and builders, and when have we done a job where we've fallen into schism, conflict, or been part of the problem. um, and that has been an incredibly meaningful transition just in my ministry in general, because it gives me permission to engage people like me authentically without having to worry and without them having to worry about whether or not I'm constantly judging things that they tell me in terms of good and bad. But instead, they know that when they talk to me, I'm listening for their own healing. And that when I speak to something that's going on with them, it's because I see unhealth or brokenness rather than badness or evil. Well, and the other really common thing, the other common theme in all of my vocations is storytelling. And so the work that I do with the Hickory Apache is specifically centered around their sacred storytelling, which has had a tremendous impact on my preaching and the way that I've approached the Hebrew Bible. as a group of sacred texts developed by a desert dwelling people on the other side of the planet. Um, and uh, and so kind of having that storytelling basis with the line through all of those stories being that healing and reconciliation.
Take another moment to pause and reflect. Father Michael sees healing, reconciliation, and storytelling as the threads that weave together different aspects of his vocation. What are the threads that weave together the different aspects of your vocation? In closing, I wonder what words of wisdom you might offer to fellow pilgrims on a journey of vocational discernment.
It's been a tremendously awarding discernment journey, even though it's been really challenging at times too. People in the discernment process tend to have uh, a way of like overexerting themselves. I've watched it happen, seminarian burnout, um, and I guess the biggest thing is to remember that we don't serve the church at the expense of ourselves, right? And so that was something that would have saved me a lot of heartache if someone had pulled me aside and said, like, you don't have to break your brain to serve the church. That doesn't serve the church. So be kind to yourselves. Remember that um, ev- every one of us, but especially those called to ministry, are beloved by Jesus. And Jesus wants us to be healthy and happy as we sort of do that work of healing and reconciliation in the world. So just remember that, I guess, the biggest piece of advice, particularly for neurodivergent people in the discernment process, is uh, don't get caught up on what other people want you to be, right? But be who Jesus wants you to be, which is you.
Trust the work, trust the small work, trust the small work of God within you. Trust the work, trust the small